The email arrived at 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on a Friday, which is the corporate coward's favorite time slot. It allows the sender to scurry out to their expensive vehicle and hit the highway before the recipient has time to process the rage. Subject: Compensation Review. Donald Thorne did not open it immediately. He let it sit there, pulsing like a migraine in the center of his monitor. He took a slow sip of his lukewarm tea and looked around the open-plan office of VectorFlow, a mid-sized software company in Silicon Valley that smelled of roasted coffee beans and quiet desperation. To his left, the sales team was playing ping-pong, high-fiving over a deal he knew they had structured incorrectly. To his right, the marketing interns were filming a video about hustle culture. Donald was 55 years old. He was the senior contracts and intellectual property analyst. He read the 400-page documents that executives signed without looking. He was the one who made sure the company did not accidentally sell the rights to its source code to a shell company in the Caribbean. He was the invisible guardrail on a highway full of reckless drivers. He finally clicked the email. "Hi, Donald. Thanks for your patience. We reviewed your stellar metrics. However, due to reallocation of third-quarter liquidity, your raise got lost in the legal department. We do not have the approval code this cycle. Let us revisit next quarter. Best, Brandon Cole, lost in the legal department." Donald stared at the phrase. It was a lie so lazy it was almost insulting. Donald was the legal department himself, or at least he was the backbone of it. The general counsel, Julian Miller, who spent 80% of his time playing golf and the other 20% asking Donald how to convert documents, would not know a budget approval code if it hit him in the face. This was the third year in a row Donald had been put off. 3 years ago it was pandemic uncertainty. 2 years ago it was market volatility. Now it was lost in the legal department. Meanwhile, Donald knew that Brandon in Human Resources had just approved a $15,000 retention bonus for a junior developer named Roger Evans who had broken the build server twice last month. Donald knew this because he processed the paperwork for the bonuses. He did not scream. He did not type a furious reply in all capital letters. Donald was a professional. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses, cleaned them with a microfiber cloth, and felt a cold switch flip in the back of his brain. It was not sadness or anger, it was clarity. They thought he was furniture, a sturdy, reliable, ergonomic chair that you sit on and forget. They assumed that because he was quiet, because he did not play ping-pong, because he did not shout in meetings, he had no leverage. They were wrong. He looked at the sales team again. They were celebrating the ironclad logistics account. It was the crown jewel of the company, an $80 million joint venture with a massive defense logistics firm. It was the deal that was going to make VectorFlow a household name in the industry. It was the deal that paid for the chief executive officer's new glass-walled office. It was also a deal that Donald had written. Not the glossy pitch deck, not the handshake. Donald wrote the contract, the master service agreement, the intellectual property indemnity schedule, and the 60-page addendum on royalty structures. Donald remembered that addendum vividly. He wrote it 3 years ago, late at night when VectorFlow was desperate and cash poor. They needed Ironclad to sign, but they could not offer them the upfront equity they wanted. So, Donald had drafted a performance-based royalty trigger. It was complex, buried in legal terminology that made your eyes bleed if you did not know how to read the fine print. Donald stood up. His knees popped slightly, a reminder of his age. He walked past the ping-pong table. "Hey, Donald, smile," one of the sales representatives yelled. "It is Friday." Donald gave him a thin, polite smile. "Have a great weekend." Justin Donald walked to the secure file room. Most things were digital now, but the original ironclad contract with the wet signatures was kept in the fireproof safe. Donald had the code. Of course he had the code. He was the only one who ever went in there. The room smelled of paper and dust. He spun the dial on the heavy steel cabinet. He pulled out the thick, navy blue binder labeled Ironclad Licensing Agreement. He opened it to page 42, clause 14C. He ran his finger over the text. The font was small, unassuming, and deadly. In the event that the licensor VectorFlow achieves 3 consecutive quarters of 99.99% uptime while processing in excess of 5 terabytes of client data, the milestone's licensor acknowledges that intellectual property rights for the core algorithm shall shift to a shared royalty model, entitling the original intellectual property architect to a retroactive commission of 0.5% of gross contract value unless a waiver is signed by said architect. He checked the signature page. Signed by the Chief Executive Officer of Ironclad. Signed by our Chief Executive Officer, Keith Bradley. And on the bottom line, Intellectual Property Architect and Drafting Analyst, signed Donald Thorne. Donald closed the binder. The silence in the file room was heavy. Lost in the legal department, he whispered. The irony was delicious. His raise was not lost. It was right here, hiding in plain sight, compounding interest for 3 years. He was not going to reply to Brandon. He was not going to beg. He was going to teach them a lesson about the importance of reading the fine print. He slipped the copy of the contract into his leather briefcase. Donald spent the weekend in his home office, which was the exact opposite of the corporate headquarters. It was quiet, organized, and had no ping-pong tables. There was only a very efficient coffee maker and a tabby cat named Barnaby who judged him from a sunbeam on the rug. Donald had the copy of the contract. Now he needed the performance data. Clause 14C was a dormant trigger. It relied entirely on performance metrics. If vector flow performed poorly, the clause meant nothing. If the company did exceptionally well, however, the clause woke up and demanded to be satisfied. Donald logged into the company admin dashboard. His access level was essentially God mode. This was not because he was a computer hacker, but because 5 years ago, the chief technology officer had grown tired of manually approving Donald's request for access to audit logs and simply granted him root access to the entire data warehouse. The chief technology officer had long since forgotten about it. People forgot a lot of things about Donald. He pulled the uptime reports for the last 24 months. The numbers were clear. In the first quarter of last year, the company had achieved 99.992% uptime. In the second quarter, it was 99.995%. In the third quarter, it reached 99.998%. There it was. The first milestone was met. 3 consecutive quarters of near-flawless performance. Donald remembered those months vividly. The engineering team had practically slept under their desks to keep the servers running. Donald had personally ordered 70 pizzas for their late-night coding sessions. The chief executive officer, Keith Bradley, had bought himself a new foreign sports car to celebrate the resilience of the team. Donald had received a $50 coffee gift card. Next, he checked the data volume metrics. The client data processed for Ironclad was 12 terabytes, 15 terabytes, and 22 terabytes, which was far above the 5 terabyte threshold required by the contract. Donald sat back, the light of the monitor reflecting in his glasses. The mathematics was simple, but the implications were staggering. A retroactive commission of 0.5% of the gross contract value. The Ironclad deal was valued at $80 million over 5 years. That meant $400,000 in base royalties, plus retroactive penalties for failure to notify, plus interest. They were looking at a minimum of $480,000. But it was not just about the money. It was about the structure of the agreement. Donald had written Clause 14C as a safeguard to protect the intellectual property value if the company ever faced financial instability in its early days. But in their arrogance, the current executive team, most of whom were hired after Donald wrote the contract, had never bothered to reread the legacy agreements. They treated the Ironclad account like a cash cow, milking it dry, completely oblivious to the fact that the fence around the pasture was electrified. Donald printed every log. He printed the quarterly reports where Keith Bradley bragged about these exact uptime statistics to the board of directors. He printed the email from the tech department confirming the flawless execution of the Ironclad protocols. He was building a fortress of paper. On Sunday night, Donald sat on his back patio with a glass of red wine. He watched the sunset bleed purple and orange over the hills. He thought about Brandon Cole and human resources. He thought about the email denying his raise. Brandon had tried to save the company maybe $10,000 a year by denying Donald his cost of living adjustment. In doing so, he had forced Donald to audit his own value. Donald took out his phone. He did not call a personal lawyer yet. Instead, he called the one person who would appreciate the irony of this situation as much as he did. He called Lawrence Reynolds, the general counsel for Ironclad Logistics. In the world of corporate contracts, Lawrence was a legend, a shark who negotiated agreements for massive logistics networks. He answered on the second ring. "Donald," Lawrence said, his voice deep and gravelly. "It is Sunday. Either the servers are down or you are resigning." "Neither, Lawrence," Donald said, swirling his wine. "I am doing some routine housekeeping. I was reviewing the master service agreement we executed 3 years ago, specifically the royalty addendum." There was a long silence on the line. Donald could hear Lawrence shifting in his leather chair. "Clause 14C?" Lawrence asked. He knew. Of course he knew. Lawrence was an excellent lawyer. He had probably flagged it years ago, chuckled at how dangerous it was for Vectraflow, and signed it because it only protected Ironclad's access while putting the burden on Vectraflow. "Yes, Clause 14C, Donald confirmed. "It seems Vectraflow has completely overlooked the notification requirements. The milestones were met 18 months ago, and they have not paid me." "They have not paid the intellectual property architect?" Lawrence asked. His voice dropped. "That compromises the indemnity shield for the entire software suite." "Technically, Vectraflow is operating our systems without a valid license right now." "Technically, yes," Donald agreed. "I thought you might want to know before I file anything." "I appreciate the warning," Lawrence said. "Let us have lunch tomorrow. The quiet Italian place on 3rd Street. Noon. I will see you then." Donald hung up. His hand was steady. He felt a sense of calm he had not felt in years. He was no longer just an employee. He was a liability, and come Monday morning, he was going to be the most expensive problem they had ever ignored. Monday afternoon, Donald met Lawrence at the restaurant. It was a dimly lit establishment called Elmbur, hidden away from the noisy streets of the city. The dark wood paneling, heavy leather booths, and quiet murmur of executives negotiating deals in whispers created an atmosphere of absolute confidentiality. Lawrence was already waiting at a corner table, a glass of mineral water in front of him. He looked like a silver-haired wolf in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his eyes sharp and observant. "I had my team review the agreement this morning," Lawrence said without preamble as Donald sat down. "You are correct. Clause 14C is ironclad. It is actually brilliant." "Who let you put that in there?" "The previous chief executive officer," Donald said, adjusting his napkin. "He was desperate to close the deal. He told me to add whatever safeguards necessary to protect our intellectual property value. He thought it protected the company from external takeovers. He did not realize it protected the creator from the company's own internal greed." Lawrence smirked. "In the current regime." "Julian Miller. Julian thinks force majeure is a foreign dessert," Donald said. "He does not read anything longer than a golf scorecard." Lawrence laughed, a dry sound that quickly subsided. "Here is the situation from our perspective, Donald. Ironclad pays Vectraflow $20 million a year. We rely on your logistics system. If Vectraflow is in breach of its own internal intellectual property compensation terms, that creates a major liability chain for us. If you sue them and win an injunction, you could theoretically freeze the software core." "I could," Donald said, "but I do not want to destroy the product. I spent months building that structure. I just want what the contract says is mine. And you want them to learn a lesson," Lawrence added, his eyes gleaming. "I want them to understand that claiming a raise is lost in the legal department is not a valid strategy." Lawrence pulled a document from his briefcase. "This is not legal advice," he said, giving the standard disclaimer. "But Ironclad takes vendor compliance very seriously. If we discover a key partner is failing to secure its intellectual property chain, we must issue a formal notice of inquiry. We will demand a complete audit of all intellectual property disbursements." He slid the document across the table. It was a draft letter addressed to Keith Bradley, the chief executive officer of Vectraflow. It demanded proof that Clause 14C had been satisfied and requested a response within 48 hours. "If you send this," Donald said, "Julian will panic." "Good," Lawrence said. "They have been overcharging us for support hours anyway. I have been looking for a reason to squeeze them. You just handed me the tools. But you realize that once I send this, they will look for the leak. They will suspect you." "They can suspect," Donald said. "But they cannot prove anything. And in California, retaliation against an employee for asserting contract rights carries severe penalties. I will send it tomorrow morning at 9, Lawrence said, calling the waiter for the check. I suggest you be in the office to watch the show. Tuesday morning, the email arrived. It went to Keith Bradley, Peter Sinclair, and Julian Miller. Donald monitored the server logs from his desk. At 9:15, Keith forwarded it to Julian, telling him to handle it and not let it slow down the quarterly sales pipeline. Julian, in his usual lazy fashion, assumed it was standard compliance junk. At 9:45, the email landed in Donald's inbox from Julian. Julian wrote, Donald, Ironclad sent some formal letter about an intellectual property audit and Clause 14C. Sounds like legacy contract nonsense. Can you draft a standard response saying we are in compliance? Do not spend too much time on it. I need you to focus on the merger due diligence. Donald replied, Hi, Julian. I will log this in the tracker. I need to pull the original files to verify the language of Clause 14C. It might take a few days. I will keep you posted. Sure thing. Take your time, Julian replied. Donald had no intention of taking his time. He was going to let the 48-hour clock run out. If Vectorflow missed the deadline, Ironclad had the contractual right to suspend payments. Donald created a secure folder on his drive. He dragged the Ray's rejection email, Julian's email telling him to handle the audit, and logs of financial discussions into it. Wednesday passed. In the company meeting, Keith Bradley bragged about their record-breaking metrics and how satisfied Ironclad was. Donald sat in the back, silent. Julian was scrolling on his phone, having completely forgotten about the audit notice. On Thursday at 5 in the afternoon, the 48-hour deadline passed. Donald did not send the response. Instead, he marked the internal ticket status as pending executive review. A minute later, Donald's phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence. Radio silence. They think it is spam, Donald replied. Lawrence sent back a single emoji, popcorn. Friday morning was the monthly audit committee meeting. The atmosphere was unusually tense. The executives gathered in the main, glass-walled conference room, surrounded by sleek white furniture and an expensive espresso machine humming in the corner. Peter Sinclair, the chief financial officer, stood at the board. He was 35, wore designer clothes, and had the arrogance of someone who had never experienced failure. He was tapping a digital pen against his tablet with an aggressive rhythmic click. Ironclad payments are showing as pending, Peter said, frowning deeply. Accounts receivable says the wire is frozen. Does anyone know why? Probably just a bank delay, Julian Miller said, spinning his pen. I will look into it. We have seen these payment processing issues before, especially at the end of the quarter when systems are busy. We need that cash flow, Peter snapped, his voice rising. We have a major off-site meeting in Tahoe next week, and our operational runway depends on these prompt transfers. I want this cleared today. A young junior analyst named Timothy Shaw spoke up from the end of the table. He opened a spreadsheet on his laptop, his fingers hovering nervously. Actually, I was looking at the liability ledger yesterday. I saw a flag on the contingent liabilities tab for royalty class B. It is accruing at 0.5% of the gross contract value. The room went silent. Peter frowned. We do not pay royalties. We are a software company, not a publishing house. Who put that line item in there? It is in the legacy contract, Timothy persisted, showing his screen to the room. Clause 14C. It triggers based on uptime milestones. The system automatically flagged it because our performance is so high. It is accumulating substantial value. Peter looked at Julian. Julian, what is this garbage? Julian shrugged, looking bored. I do not know. Probably some old template text the previous legal counsel forgot to remove when they drafted the original licensing templates. Just ignore it. I cannot just ignore a flagged liability, Timothy said, his voice shaking slightly under the pressure. The auditors will see it during the end-of-the-year review. It could raise red flags about our reporting compliance. Timothy, Peter said, his voice dropping to a cold, threatening tone. We are not paying royalties. Delete the flag. Reclassify it as a system error in the ledger database immediately. Timothy looked uncomfortable. He looked at Donald, who was sitting quietly in the corner, holding a notebook. Donald did not say a word, but he gave the young man a steady, calm look. Donald knew that instructing an analyst to suppress a known liability constituted a serious compliance violation, a direct breach of corporate governance. But he wanted Peter to document his own negligence. Timothy turned back to his keyboard, swallowing hard. "Okay, reclassifying his error," he murmured. With a few keystrokes, the red flag disappeared. They had just committed financial fraud, suppressing a known liability in front of witnesses. Donald noted the time in his notebook, 10:14 in the morning. After the meeting, Timothy sent Donald a private message. "Donald, that clause has your initials. You wrote it. What should I do?" Donald replied, "Timothy, if I were you, I would send a formal email to Peter confirming his instruction to delete that flag. Copy your personal email just in case. Protect yourself." Timothy did. 10 minutes later, Donald received a copy of the message. Over the weekend, Donald met with his attorney, Evelyn Sharp. She was a formidable lawyer who specialized in employment law and corporate whistleblower cases. Her office was small but filled with books and legal journals. She offered him a cup of hot tea and reviewed his papers. "They are incredibly foolish," Evelyn said, reviewing the file logs and emails. "They are arrogant," Donald corrected. "Well," Evelyn smiled, "arrogance is about to become very expensive for them. Here is the plan. Ironclad will sue for breach. Vectraflow will panic. They will try to blame you for not warning them. That is when we file the whistleblower lawsuit for retaliation, wage theft, and violation of financial regulations." She drafted a letter of representation citing California Labor Code Section 1102.5 and California Civil Code Section 3300. The Labor Code protected whistleblowers who refused to participate in illegal activities, like financial fraud. The Civil Code established the right to seek damages for breach of contract. "Do not send this yet," Evelyn said. "Wait until Ironclad files their lawsuit. 10 minutes later, you send this to Human Resources. It freezes them. They cannot fire you while you have an active claim." On Sunday night, Donald could not sleep. He thought about the last 5 years of working late, missing family events, and giving everything to the company. They had looked at him and seen nothing. Well, tomorrow they were going to see him clearly. He laid out his best dark suit for the next morning. He checked his email one last time. Nothing from Peter or Julian Silleaf. Well, gentlemen, Donald thought. Monday morning, 9 o'clock, the monthly company-wide meeting. Keith Bradley stood on the stage in the break room, telling the staff how they were changing the world and projecting 20% growth. He was full of energy, pacing back and forth in front of the projection screen. The employees sat in rows of chairs, holding their coffee cups and looking tired under the fluorescent lights. Donald stood at the back near the exit, his arms crossed. At 8:52, the double glass doors of the break room swung open. Two men in formal dark suits walked in, followed by Lawrence Reynolds. The room went silent. The crowd of engineers and sales reps parted as the three men walked down the center aisle. Keith stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Can I help you?" Keith asked, squinting against the stage lights. Lawrence walked straight to the stage, his expression serious. "Keith Bradley," he asked. "Yes, that is me." "What is the meaning of this?" One of the process servers handed Keith a thick stack of legal papers. "You are being served with a civil lawsuit for breach of contract, intellectual property theft, and fraud," the man said. "Plaintiff is Ironclad Logistics. We are terminating the licensing agreement for cause." Keith turned pale, looking at the papers. "You cannot terminate. That is an $80 million contract. It is the core of our business operations." "It was," Lawrence said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "Now it is a lawsuit for $120 million, including triple damages for fraud. You failed to respond to our formal audit notice within the 48-hour window. Your license to use the software is officially revoked." Keith looked at the papers. "Page 42, Clause 14C, Lawrence said. "You do not own the rights to the software until you pay the royalty architect." Julian Miller grabbed the papers from Keith. His hand started to shake as he read the page. "The cost of living adjustment," Julian whispered. He looked at the back of the room, locking eyes with Donald. Every head in the room turned to look at Donald. The crowd of 200 employees whispered. Brandon Cole, the human resources partner, stood frozen, holding his green smoothie and staring. Donald did not hide. He walked forward down the center aisle, the crowd parting before him. He reached the stage and handed Julian an envelope containing Evelyn's representation letter. "I believe my raise just got found in the legal department," Donald said, his voice calm. He turned to Lawrence. "Shall we go to the boardroom?" 10 minutes later, Donald, Lawrence, Keith, Peter, and Julian were gathered in the main conference room. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Keith was desperate. "Donald, we can fix this. We can give you the raise. 10%, 20%, whatever you want." Donald laughed. "We are past that, Keith. We are talking about Clause 14C. "We did not know about this," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "I sent you the email, Julian," Donald said. "You told me to prioritize the merger due diligence instead of checking the contract details. You did not read the attachment." Lawrence leaned in. "Vectraflow owes Donald $482,000 in royalties. And because you ordered the suppression of the liability flag in the ledger, the officers face personal liability under corporate transparency regulations." Timothy documented the entire exchange. Peter was sweating, realizing he had been caught ordering the deletion of a liability. "What do you want?" Keith asked, sounding completely defeated. Donald slid the term sheet across the table. "First, payment of $482,000 in back royalties. Second, a formal apology. Third, reinstatement of the royalty clause. Fourth, my legal fees paid. Fifth, a promotion to Director of Strategic Compliance and IP Governance, reporting directly to the board with authority to audit all executive expenses." "If you do not sign," Lawrence said, "we walk. The lawsuit will go public, and your pending merger valuation will collapse." Keith looked at Peter, then at Julian. He had no choice. He signed. The wire transfer hit Donald's account on Wednesday. $482,340. The changes were immediate. The board of directors met in an emergency session that afternoon. Upon reviewing the documented compliance violations and the threat of the lawsuit, they demoted Keith from daily operations. Peter was fired after Donald's first audit revealed he was charging personal trips and bachelor parties to the company. Julian remained, but he was terrified of Donald. Donald hired Timothy as his senior analyst. The company culture changed. The ping-pong table was gone. The sales team learned to submit their contracts for review early. 6 months later, Brandon Cole from Human Resources sent Donald an email regarding his annual review. "Hi Donald, your new compensation package has been approved by the board." "No issues this time," Donald replied. "Thanks, Brandon. Make sure you file it correctly. We would not want it to get lost in the legal department again." Donald closed his laptop. The sun was setting over Silicon Valley. The devil is in the details, they say. They are wrong. The devil is in the person who reads the details.